Hello everyone. Thank you for joining us this afternoon. My name is Soha Youssef, and I'm convening this seminar series on behalf of unu-merit and Maastricht University in the Netherlands. The Migration Seminar Series invites researchers, practitioners, policymakers, and others to discuss their work related to migration. Before I will introduce today's speaker, there are some housekeeping that I'll need to do. Our speaker's talk will last for approximately 40 minutes, after which we'll have 20 minutes for discussion and questions from the audience. I'd like to ask you to keep your questions until after our speaker is done with the presentation, unless, of course, they're clarification questions. And you can put the questions either in the chat box, or to make it a bit more interactive, you can just use the raise your hand function and we will allocate turns and try our best to take as many questions as possible. Please, in the meantime, keep your microphones muted. Your camera can be turned on if you would like to, but please be aware that we are recording this seminar series for distribution on our YouTube channel. On our YouTube channel, you can also find recordings from previous seminar series from the past years. And now let me introduce our speaker for today. We're very happy to welcome Dr. Jasmin Lilian Diab. She is the director of the Institute for Migration Studies at the Lebanese American University, where she also serves as an assistant professor and the coordinator of migration studies. In 2025, her research was awarded the Lisa Gilad Prize from the International Association for the Study of Forced Migration. She is a research affiliate at York's University Center for Refugee Studies, a global fellow at Brown University, and a visiting professor at Sciences Po. Dr. Diab holds a PhD in international relations and diplomacy, focusing on refugees, asylum, and security. And with that introduction, let me then give the floor to Dr. Jasmin.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Soha, and for your generous introduction, and thank you so much for the space. It's a pleasure to be presenting at another one of unu-merit's events. Thank you again so much for the invite. As articulated, I think, prior to everyone signing up for this, I will be presenting my work today on queer IDPs, so internally displaced persons from South Lebanon. I'm going to pull up my notes. Wonderful. So this paper in particular is a qualitative examination of the intersection of queerness, displacement, and armed conflict in Lebanon. For those of you that know absolutely anything about the Lebanese space, you know displacement, refugees, everything in between is one of the biggest topics we discuss across the country. However, these intersections and this dehomogenizing of displaced groups rarely takes place, and this is hopefully what we intend to work on at our institute and what I hope my research focuses on the most. To give you a little bit of a background on why we conducted this study and what the political realities on the ground were, this is a paper that highlights, of course, the protracted nature of the Hezbollah-Israel conflict, the recent escalations that started in 2023, and displacement in Lebanon based on this ongoing conflict that has been going on, of course, for decades, where we also saw an escalation of it in 2006. Displacement in Lebanon as a result is both recurrent and layered and affects citizens, refugees, and marginalized subgroups differently. And this is what I hope the paper sheds light on today. The originality of this research is that it is one of the first empirical accounts that centers queer internally displaced people, persons in Lebanon as a group in an active conflict zone. It does also feature testimonies from the community, a community often enough that is very difficult to reach, not only difficult to reach, also difficult to gain their trust and to have them speak to you also along these lines. Beyond that, the study scope is, of course, not as large as we had hoped it to be. This paper is based on 18 in-depth interviews with LGBT IDPs from Lebanese, Syrian, and Palestinian backgrounds that are displaced from South Lebanon. Many of the participants of the study were interviewed in Beirut following their displacement. So we caught them either online, we spoke to them over the phone, we spoke to them in safe spaces across Beirut that they permitted us to come and see them in. And so you'll find that the methodology is very adaptive to the not only very specific group we're speaking to, but also to their security conditions as well. Beyond that, the study scope is also small because of the limited access, as well as the invisibility of the community. When the data was collected between November 2023 and March 2024, the conflict was at its peak. The South was completely off bounds. We were unable to collect data on the ground. And beyond that, a lot of people as well were invisibilized by the conflict, either intentionally or by humanitarian programming. And I will unpack what I mean by that in a bit. To frame this reality, I think theoretically was a bit of a challenge, but I drew in this paper on three different theories. First, intersectionality theory, to capture how sexual orientation, gender identity, refugee IDP status, as well as nationality intersect to create these layered vulnerabilities. Largely because the population that we were looking at when we say queer internally displaced persons as a result of this conflict included Lebanese IDPs, but also included Syrian and Palestinian refugees who were now internally displaced and thus doubly displaced by this conflict. Intersectionality theory was also very central to emphasizing, of course, that queerness is not a secondary identity in displacement, but rather that it is a structural determinant. It is a very big part of the conversation, and not only for the hierarchy of vulnerabilities within people's singular identities, and that's something I can unpack a little bit more in the Q&A, but also for what they identify as the most vulnerable part of themselves. For many queer IDPs, Lebanese, Syrian, or Palestinian, they found their queerness to be the highest form of vulnerability as they attempted to navigate the conflict much more than their displacement. And for those of you that are interested in reading the full piece, I can share it with you. We have incredibly powerful testimonies across the paper that highlight this. Another theory that I employed here was queer theory. I wanted to, of course, in this paper, challenge heteronormative assumptions within humanitarianism and really discuss beyond that how dominant frameworks really fail to imagine queerness as central to the displacement experience, let alone really design responses around it. Again, the findings will hopefully highlight this. And the third theoretical framework that I navigated through was the human security paradigm. And this paradigm was employed to shift the focus from territorial or state security to personal and community level security. And through this human security paradigm, I was able to center the research on the needs for protection from violence, exploitation, and deprivation for queer IDPs. Many of the testimonies, as I will highlight, are very centered on exactly what the community needs and exactly their specific intersectional, gender-specific experiences in displacement too. So the main findings of this paper were very difficult to narrow down. While the sample was very small, the findings are very complex. And once again, conversations around vulnerability and where that begins and ends for members of the community was very difficult to pin down. Let alone, nonetheless, I'll walk you through a few of these findings, and I'm again happy to discuss as we go back and forth later on. One of the main findings of this paper was around heightened vulnerability and self-isolation. So violence from authorities, humanitarian workers, and even fellow IDPs. So many of the participants we spoke to reported facing harassment from municipal authorities, from armed groups, and even from humanitarian workers who were locals and also hold discriminatory views. One participant, a gay Syrian man, 37 years old, who was displaced from the South, said, "Even international humanitarian staff are often homophobic locals, so where do I find a safe space?" So this complicates reaching out for humanitarian actors and reaching out for help for this community. As while a lot of the humanitarian actors, the local staff, the municipal authorities, even armed forces, recognized the vulnerability of these individuals as displaced groups, they did not want to enter into a discussion even around their queerness. They either completely separated that from the conversation or were homophobic and were unapproachable about the conversation. And as a result, participants not only self-isolated, but described self-isolation as a survival strategy. Self-isolation, both voluntary and forced, of course. So participants described withdrawing to avoid visibility, and this limited their access to shelter and medical services and psychosocial support. So a gay 28-year-old man who is internally displaced from the South speaks of the fear of being outed. Imagine this conflict where they are physically forced to move, then serves as another catalyst to outing them and making them even further vulnerable within their own communities and within their own spaces. He says, being branded as queer here is very scary. I cannot begin to tell you about the toll that all of this has on our mental health amid these incredibly insecure and stressful times. And alongside conversations on self-isolation and heightened vulnerability, of course, we entered into a conversation around the lack of tailored support and services. So there was an absence of queer responsive health and psychosocial care. And since the conflict escalated, queer-friendly NGOs from Beirut that typically reached out to South Lebanon in order to support the community lost access to the community. And of course, for those of you that are following the conflict was very much centralized and the most intense in South Lebanon, and then later on extended to Beirut and other areas. Beyond that, I think one of the most important things that I try to do in this paper is not only to unpack the internally displaced community and the subgroups there, but also to unpack the queer community, because within these spaces, there is definitely a hierarchy of vulnerability within the LGBT community. And while the acronym encompasses everyone that identifies as queer, not everyone is as vulnerable as the other in these spaces. So much of the findings also center around how trans participants in the study, for instance, described being completely excluded from shelters. I'll pull a quote up for you guys. A 33-year-old trans woman from Syria recounted being turned away from women's shelters and not accepted in men's shelters or family shelters either. She says, currently, I am hiding with a group of migrant domestic workers in an apartment further from the border. They are kind, but this is not sustainable. And this speaks to the compounded danger that trans individuals face when shelter responses are rigidly gendered, but also how the humanitarian space remains ill-equipped for any form of identity that challenges the binary or that really falls a little bit outside humanitarian programming to begin with. To this point on who is more vulnerable within the LGBT community, the trans community being very high on the list, queer men experienced homophobia a lot more intensely in our findings than, for instance, femme-presenting lesbian women who blended more into society or who were a little bit more invisible to authorities, etc. And again, happy to unpack this. Much of our findings also centered around coping mechanisms and resilience. So informal support networks via digital communication, WhatsApp groups for queer IDPs in the South to share tips of where to find housing and healthcare and transportation to Beirut. And participants highlighted, similar to this Palestinian participant, she says, at one point there were more than 100 participants in one of the groups. We shared updates, we found meals, found places to sleep or hideouts. And this fed into, once again, not just this intention to self-isolate, but also the intention to conceal one's identity. So strategic concealment of identity was a very big theme across the paper. Queer IDPs concealed their identity from authorities, but the feasibility varies. So as I said, a femme-presenting lesbian woman from South Lebanon said to us, I stayed at a woman's shelter for 4 months with no issue. I watched many of my gay friends get turned away, many of my trans friends get turned away. And so this reveals how perceived conformity to heteronormative gender roles can also provide temporary safety. And this is a privilege not afforded to more visibly gender nonconforming individuals, such as femme-presenting gay men, for instance, or transgender persons as well. There was a preference within the community as we spoke to them to skip over larger humanitarian organizations because they perceived these humanitarian organizations skipped over them. There was a leniency and a preference towards smaller grassroots organizations, human rights networks within their communities that participants described as not catering specific to the queer community, but also not being discriminatory towards the community. So they would receive services like absolutely everyone else. While they required some tailored services, many participants in our study describe that these local human rights NGOs were lifelines and that they gave them at least the bare minimum of what they needed without discrimination. Of course, as we talk about the humanitarian space, while it did absolutely brilliant work across the conflict and was very pivotal in the response, there were barriers to protection and assistance within the community and for the community, and this was very much rooted in this conversation around mistrust of humanitarian actors. As I described earlier, many participants said that even if you were to make it to a humanitarian actor in the South, let's say it's one of the biggest organizations or a big UN agency, many of the local staff employed in these humanitarian organizations are from the homophobic community. So it wasn't that you were approaching a UN agency or a big humanitarian actor, but rather individuals. And that constituted a very big barrier for participants as well. And beyond that, this conversation of mistrust extended into conversations around a lack of trust in humanitarian actors and the space as well. Many queer IDPs that we interviewed from the South that had made it to Beirut described past harm or exclusion by service providers, especially trans participants. A trans man from Syria, a Syrian refugee in Lebanon, describes that the conflict forced him to scramble for help, he says, and essentially come back out into society, but only to be rejected again. So while the community was not necessarily thriving in the South, absolutely not, in a very homophobic and intense climate, the fact that they were able to self-isolate and invisibilize themselves was very much of a lifeline. Many of the participants described how this war thrust them into the spotlight, and they did not ask for this either as well. And beyond that, of course, to give credit to humanitarian actors that are expanding their programming to include gender as a big variable and gender diversity slowly, there was also a lack of awareness among participants around local humanitarian actors in Beirut, what these services were, where to seek out protection. So while many of the participants were part of these WhatsApp groups, were part of these conversations, a handful of participants as well had absolutely no idea that they could receive such services too. There were nationality-based disparities because, as I said, what this paper really tried to do was blur the lines between what it means to be an IDP and a refugee. Many people internally displaced have a refugee background, but that doesn't mean that as we look at queerness, that this is the only determining factor in the conversation. And because we interviewed people from different nationalities, we found certainly that there were nationality-based disparities. So Syrians and Palestinian queer IDPs faced compounded marginalization. They are refugees, they are queer, there is a dual stigma, and Lebanese participants recognize this. So Lebanese participants would say things along the lines of our Syrian and Palestinian brothers and sisters within the queer community are facing much larger hurdles than us. They have refugee versus host dynamics to navigate alongside their gender identities. And for many queer participants that we interviewed as well, they highlighted the role of their families in getting them into shelters, them traveling as a family unit, etc., as also defiance against kind of this exclusionary system. And while Lebanese queer IDPs faced hostility, as I said, there was something around cultural familiarity that separated them a little bit more from Syrians and Palestinians' experiences. So, though Lebanese queer individuals certainly remained highly stigmatized, particularly in the South, they were more familiar with local systems, they had families, community ties to fall back on, and even when the situation was strained or conditional, they still had these networks, and that served as a very big contributor to their ability to access shelter and services and protections as part of a family unit. I think next I'll move on a little bit to what this study filled as far as gaps in the literature. As I said, this conversation on forced migration and queer discourse is definitely a very big and growing area of focus. But this study in particular not only focuses on bringing queerness to the center of displacement discourse, it insists on not treating it as a peripheral identity or as one of the variables or one of the boxes we tick when we're looking at the community. I wanted this paper to move a little bit beyond these legal protection frameworks, this asylum conversation, to really explore what happens inside borders during conflict before asylum seeking even becomes an option, and what happens for people where that's not even on their mind, right? They're not even looking for a formal process. They're not even thinking at the level of legal protection frameworks. They're thinking to survive day to day. And I think it really, as I said earlier, I wanted to critically question this refugee IDP binary. Who is a refugee? Who is an IDP? What are these definitions? Because the paper shows how many queer people experience multiple displacement, spatial, legal, and identity-based, and how often enough this categorization doesn't matter, especially in a complex landscape like Lebanon, especially in a complex region like ours, and especially when displacement and migration and movement across borders in the region is so cyclical and happens in many waves and forms and has happened back and forth for so many years as well. So, what literature did this paper fill? This paper filled what I found as a very big gap in queer IDPs in active conflict zones. Virtually no empirical data on queer IDPs in contexts like South Lebanon were out there. This is not only true to Lebanon, it's true to other conflict zones as well. Beyond that, it looked at intersectional displacement experiences. And of course, while intersectionality and displacement experiences is heavily covered and is an area of research that we really embrace and contribute to, very few studies compare experiences across nationalities, like Lebanese, Syrians, and Palestinians within the same queer IDP population. And we wanted, once again, to question that binary and question the terms that we're using as well. We wanted to move beyond this very rigid conversation in the forced migration space of what terms we use. Beyond that, it really unpacks how informal queer networks substitute for institutional failure in humanitarian aid delivery, because much of the findings across the paper were around adaptability, WhatsApp groups, messaging systems, even spaces that were known to be for the queer community and a hub for the community, and how this information was moved across different groups and different regions as well. This was largely informal, largely improvised, and largely designed by the community for the community, which I hope that the paper also brings forth as well. And it really breaks new ground, I hope, on how shelter access is mediated by gender expression and how queer mental health needs remain unmet in IDP responses, and how conversations around protection struggle very much to exit a gender binary, as well as to exit a binary of legal terminology. So, are we talking about refugees or IDPs? Are we talking about men or women? Fine, they could be gay or straight, but these trans people, where do we put them? These horrible things that we heard across our interviews and our data collection, and continue to hear with much of the work that we do as we're continuing to study with the community this reality as well. And what I hope, and I think I'll wrap up with this before we go into a Q&A, is that the study really confronts active conflict, not just post-displacement or asylum-seeking scenarios, and how a conversation on forced migration and displacement needs to start within an active conflict as well. Of course, the word active conflict I use loosely, as this is very not only temporal, but also very difficult to pin down in Lebanon. And I'm also happy to discuss this with you as well. The paper also captures real-time strategies of queer people, how they survive war, how they survive displacement. Many of these real-time strategies that are outlined in the paper are still being used to this day as the conflict continues to worsen in the south and not de-escalate even with a ceasefire. And beyond this, it reveals how queer-led community care and resistance networks really emerge in kind of, dare I say, the vacuum that traditional humanitarian responses create. And the findings from this also provoke the field really to reimagine protection frameworks. This is much of the focus of our work, and this paper is no different. We always advocate for a reimagination of protection frameworks that don't wait until queerness is legible to law, as in, asylum, but respond to its material and emotional and political dimensions in place. And to wrap up again, and happy to discuss, the paper really attempted to destabilize this assumption that displacement is only about loss, right? So it is also about adaptation, creativity, and survival. And the community is a very big example of that. In speaking to them, we definitely hear so much about loss, but the lessons learned from this study, even with such a small sample, and we've been snowballing to grow the sample and continue to do this, really helps inform the humanitarian space and the protection space around how adaptation and creativity can create more inclusive humanitarian programming, especially in the areas of protection. While I know I have about 5 or 10 more minutes, I think I'll stop there and I'll hand it over for questions. And I thank you so much for listening. Thank you.